back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scaleups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And on today's episode, we've got Jonathan Corrales, something of a unicorn in that his background is engineering and software development management, but with a twist, he also helps technical folks to prepare for interviews. Any of you who have been in this space know that tech interviews are no joke, and they're an easy thing to make a mistake that can cost you on. And it's his gig to fix that problem. But enough from me. Let's hear from Jonathan. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Jonathan.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I started my career off as a software developer, programming web apps. Been in the industry for 20 years now. And most recently, with all the layoffs that were happening, I just wanted to focus on helping people get through the interviews. I know that they're really hairy. They can be really complicated. And I've been doing it for about 5 months now and
Awesome.
just having a blast doing it. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you for coming. That's awesome. You know, in a time like this, it's that much more important to maximize the opportunity when you get one. So preparing for an interview, something I've believed in for the entirety of my career, is just that much more important now, given you're not likely to get 5 of them, you're likely to get 1 or 2. So that's great. What do you find are common mistakes that people make that you can help them get past, Jonathan?
That's a great question. So the first one that is just blatant is not preparing for the interview, not doing your due diligence, reading up on the company, their products, their competitors, saying no when the interviewer comes back to you and says, "Do you have questions for me?"
Oof.
That, I think, is the biggest problem I see in most interviews, and all the ones that I've been in anyways. And it usually leaves the interviewers wondering if you're even interested in the position.
I completely agree. A lot of folks don't realize that interviewers, despite what you might read about in social media, are human beings too. And if they feel
That's
they're
right.
going to be rejected because you're not interested, they're less likely to move forward as well.
That's right. Yeah. And the other thing that I've noticed, and I've been looking into the research on this, is that interviewers are they're not trying to grill you, right? They don't want you to fail at the interview. What they're looking for is they're trying to understand what it's like to work with you. So what does that experience look like, right? And a lot of times that what happens, especially in tech interviews, is the interviewer will ask you a question, like design a piece of software. And so the person that's interviewing, the candidate, starts to go off on this huge speech about how they're going to do all of these wonderful things. And it's 20 minutes into a 45-minute conversation, and they've dominated the entire conversation. So, in a meeting, you don't want one person dominating the entire conversation. You want to have a give and take. And so interviewers
100%.
are looking at things like that. Yeah. And once you realize that the people that you're working with, that are interviewing with, your audience, they're your future coworkers, then it changes the way that you approach the interview, right? You want it to be more of a conversation. You want it to be more of a brainstorming session, right? A form of collaboration. Like that's really what I'm trying to get to when I'm working with somebody.
I don't think I could possibly agree with you any more than I do. One of the things that I talk with interviewers about, as I tend to coach to the other side of the desk, is that you can't allow this to devolve into an interrogation. It needs to be a conversation. You're going to learn so much more if that person is relaxed enough to open up and talk. So that's huge. And I'll be honest, I think that disconnect is part of the reason why we read so much about negative experiences with folks working in companies. I've said it for a very long time now. It's both parties' responsibility to determine if this is a good opportunity. So if I'm the interviewer and you're the interviewee, it's my job to make sure you have the skills to do the job. It's the best of my ability to determine whether or not you're a good cultural match for my organization so that you as an individual thrive within it, and to make sure that this career opportunity makes sense for you so you're going to stay in it for enough time that you get what you need out of it, but also I can turn a profit as an employer. But for you, it's just as important, if not more so. And I've found that in the 20-something years I've been doing this, there's far more bad matches than there are bad companies and bad candidates.
Yeah, that's a good one. I was actually trying to look into some of the research on that too. One study that was done, I think it was by Glassdoor, said that they found a very weak correlation between the interview performance and on-job performance. That's fascinating to me because, all these interviews, right? Online assessments, now you have writing examples, take-home tests. You have all this stuff to try to determine whether or not this person's qualified or a good fit for the position. And there isn't strong evidence that I know of. I'm sure it's out there. If someone knows it, please send it to me. There's not a strong amount of evidence to suggest that on-the-job performance is in any way, shape, or form related to interview performance. It reminds me a lot of like standardized tests for colleges. So an SAT or a GRE or a GMAT or whatever. You're studying for the test, but what you're really measuring is how well you perform on the test. It doesn't say anything about your ability to perform when you're actually in a classroom. So that disconnect is interesting. I'm not really sure that there's a good solution for it. I've always been hoping that we've tried something like a trial run, if you will, where like a person actually gets paid to work for like 1 or 2 weeks. But the whole process is just very very interesting.
We used to, way back in the day when I was doing staffing, we used to have a vehicle called contract to hire. And it's really fallen out of favor. You don't see it nearly as much as you used to back then. But the beauty of it was it gave an employer and an employee 3 to 6 months to figure each other out. If it didn't work out at the end, the employee could rightly put completed contract, no scar on their resume. And it gave them that extended period because you're right. Gosh, I've interviewed and hired for my own companies internally and for external clients, hundreds of people, maybe even thousands at this point. And I can think of quite a few people who I wish I could get the person who I interviewed to actually show up to work every day because they certainly didn't seem like the same person.
Yeah, I mean, talking about mistakes, right? Like that's sort of an after side effect. I'm not sure how to really address it, but sometimes people prepare so well for the interview that that's the expectation they set, the bar that they're setting, and then they show up to work and they don't bring that same level of preparedness, right? And so then there's another disconnect that happens when it's like, you weren't the person that we interviewed. Like, how did you, right? There's like, why aren't you performing? And then there's all this like bad stuff that happens because you set the bar so high. So it's really challenging to kind of get the interviewing right. So that, I can't say that I have all of the answers, but I will say that it's interesting. It's the best way that I can put it.
This may be an oversimplification, so please feel free to call me out on it if you think I'm oversimplifying. But I think the interview and the ongoing employment scenario are both hurt by insufficient, open, and honest dialogue on both sides.
Yes.
There's a lot of reasons for it, and we can dig into some of them. But I think a big part of the angst that you seem to see everywhere ubiquitously on social media today between employers and employees stems from, number one, the disconnect. We're still thinking like we're our grandparents and that we're hiring somebody who's going to work for us for the rest of our lives. Number one. And number two, both parties are doing a poor job of setting and managing expectations, about aligning goals. So I know for me to succeed, I need you to do X, but for this to be worth it for you, I need to do Y. We're not communicating that through. And because of that first dishonesty, I think we're creating endings that are unnecessarily harsh. If I know that there's a probability you're going to work with me for 1 or 2 years, and then you're going to go off to the next place in your career, but if I can make that 1 or 2 years positive, end it on a positive note, that there's a strong chance when next our goals align that you can come work with me again. How much better is that than what you see so often where, these horror stories of how jobs end on both sides?
Yeah, I agree. And I actually had this conversation with an employer a couple of years ago where they were getting upset that employees were leaving after like 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time, Robert Half technologies or IT. I can't remember the exact like division of Robert Half, but they posted this report that said the average person stays at a company about 3 to 4 years. And I said, well, you know, instead of being upset that you only got 3 to 4 years, be happy that you at least got 3 to 4 years, because especially in the tech industry, it's very common to jump around. It's
Yeah.
become one of the few ways that you can get a significant pay increase, right? Is going from one job to the other. And that's unfortunate. So one of the things that I think is happening right now is there's like this shift, and I don't know exactly how to describe it well, but there's this like shift in power dynamics, where employees today have a lot more options than they did way back when, especially because of the internet. You can now work for any company in the world. So you're no longer tied to an employer that's within driving distance, right? And, people have aspirations. They want to do great things. They want to work on cool projects. They want to change the world. So, they're looking for opportunities for growth. And unfortunately, staying with the same employer for longer than 3 to 4 years isn't the way to do that anymore. Maybe at one point in time it was, back when, our grandparents were working and they could be at one company for 20, 30 years. But today, the only way to really get growth is to go from one place to the other.
Yeah.
So,
I talk a lot. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Please, I'm sorry.
I talk a lot in my leadership framework, EFG, Engage, Fulfill, Grow. I talk about a manager's responsibility is to engage with their team and make sure that they feel heard and valued, to make sure that they're fulfilled, their personal values align with the mission of the team of the company, and that they're growing both in their jobs and responsibilities and ideally beyond. And I talk about a good ending is when one of those three things breaks and that person chooses to leave because of it. If and I know you're not, but let's say you were a junior developer and you came to work with me, and I knew both through the interview process and through our employee review periods and our general conversations that your aspiration was to become a software development manager at some point. So the next step for you would be to be a senior developer, maybe, just in our hypothetical example. If I didn't have that space on my team and you've been a rock star up to that point and you got an opportunity to be a senior developer somewhere else, why would you not take that? There's no realistic expectation in any sane world that you wouldn't. So why would I then act as though you just stole money from me or in some way betrayed me by
Exactly.
doing
Yeah.
the logical thing for your career? So
Right.
by accepting that this is a natural end and having a graceful exit for you, fast forward another couple of years and now you're going from senior developer to team lead, maybe I've got that role and you remember me positively, so you come back. That's that communication and alignment of goals that I was talking about earlier that I think employers could do 1,000 times better.
Yeah, there's this great quote from Sir Richard Bronson, from Virgin Atlantic, right? And he said, train your people so they can leave you, but treat them so well that they won't want to.
I've got his book
And
here
that's
somewhere.
and that's stuck with me forever. Yeah, there you go. And that stuck with me forever because that's really what we're talking about here is employers not only having a pleasant onboarding experience, right? But a pleasant professional development experience and a pleasant exit experience, right? Because if we're thinking about the longevity of a company, we really want good referrals, right? Good word of mouth, a great brand, a great employer brand, right? People want to work with us, want to work for us. So, if the company's going to survive any amount of time, we want to have all those things. We want to have a great Glassdoor review, section and, good rating and all that stuff. And that's only going to happen if we're treating everybody at every single touch point with respect and admiration and, and all the things that they're looking for. A lot of employees are complaining that they're not getting enough recognition and, for the work that they're doing. Gallup and Harvard Business Review are constantly pushing out articles about the lack of engagement and, unhappiness. And I think employers, think that all this stuff costs a ton of money, and it doesn't. Flexibility, for example, right, costs virtually nothing today. You can work remotely from anywhere. Give anyone the opportunity to work at any time that they want, whatever works best for them. And then they come out with something like a return to office mandate. So it's almost like the two sides aren't talking to each other. They're not saying like, here's what I need. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is it. You mentioned something there that's interesting. So return to office, I think that's a layered thing that doesn't get enough attention by itself. So I'll give you an example. There's a local insurance company to where I live, a national brand, but they've got a big office here. The municipality that I live in gave them a massive tax break to employ a certain number of people there. When COVID happened and they went remote, that was fine. It's not like they had a choice. But when COVID was over, the city came back to them and said, you're going to need to give the money back. And so they instituted a massive return office campaign that cost them a significant portion of their employees. Now, I don't know that there was a graceful way out of that, but I do know they didn't have the conversation with their team saying, we're initiating RTO for this reason. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that it would have been better received had they been more open and honest about the reason why. Going to your point about communication.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think so too. There was an exec at one of the big tech firms that said, we don't have data to back up this decision of going back to the office, but trust me, it's better for us. Right. Yeah. And, whenever someone says, trust me, it's kind of like, should I trust you? Right. There's always this question in your head. And I think it's very, very normal. Like, why are you telling me to trust you? Right. That kind of thing. And so a lot of it isn't really explained, so employees are left with these questions like, why are we going back? And what's the benefit? What are the numbers? Like, was it a productivity thing or an effectiveness thing? They're not saying anything, and I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks, in a lot of my posts and commentary, where employers expect employees to over communicate, but they're not giving that back to the employees.
100% agree.
And I think that they can. Agree. It can. And it doesn't cost them anything to say, look, we don't know why we're doing this, or we don't know if we're going to do layoffs, or we don't know. Like, just simply come out and say, I don't know.
I could not agree more. Again, yeah. I'm starting to feel like I'm leading your fan club. So do you remember the 1990s show X-Files?
Yes.
Yeah. So when that show first came out, Chris, and I'm drawing a blank on his last name, but the executive producer didn't have the budget to have the special effects he wanted to. So instead of make it some chintzy, cheesy show, we had a lot of late night flashlight chases through the woods. And you just get a quick splash of the monster's face for a flash of a second. And what did you do as a human being? You filled in your biggest fear. That monster became the scariest to you. And as somebody who's been in business for more than 25 years, who's been in consulting for more than a decade, it's my lived experience that when you don't give someone sufficient information, they do a flashlight chase at night through the woods with what you do give them. I have never.
That was actually something that I wanted.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to quote you on something that you said recently in one of your podcasts, where you said just that. Like, you have to over communicate.
Yeah.
Why? Because if there's a moment of silence, our brains are wired to fill that silence in, or those like gaps, with the most negative, worst case scenario possible information, right? So you said that. I just wanted to call that out because I think it's a keen insight. Like, that's why we want to over communicate, right? If I say, hey Jerry, how would I handle like this problem that I'm dealing with, and you gave me advice, you'd be like, well, I don't think Jonathan even listened to me. But if I were to say, hey, Jerry, I'm trying your advice. Hey, it's working. I'm giving you feedback. You're like, oh, yeah, he's actually trying what I told him to. So then you're more inclined to give me more advice when I ask for it later. But if not, it just seems like, it's falling on deaf ears.
Exactly. And the other part of communication that people forget, especially if they aren't great communicators, is if they feel like they're over communicating, if they're like, oh my gosh, I've said this 50 times, they're probably just about at the level they should be. The second part is repetition is the mother of retention. So even if I did tell you one time, even if I did tell you two times, it might not yet have stuck. It might be the third time or the fourth time, or maybe I explain it a little bit differently, or maybe I explain it in the presence of somebody else who tells you a little bit differently. Whatever the circumstance, sometimes, and it's not a lack of attention, sometimes it's the fourth or fifth time that it clicks. I'll tell you another quick story because I know you're a martial artist. So you do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I did traditional karate. And we used to have guest instructors come all the time from Okinawa and places like that. It was always awesome. But it was frustrating for instructors sometimes because they'd be out there and they would be demonstrating something and the people would be doing their best to emulate. And then this guy would come and do the exact same thing. And the students would be like, oh, I've never seen it that way before. And the instructor's like, every week we do this. Every week we do this. But it was a different voice, a different way. And that time it clicked.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in jiu-jitsu. It's almost like, I don't know if it's because we're not paying attention, or if it's just, life is happening and part of our brain is on something else. But we can look at a move and see the same move done 100 times, but on the 101th or first or whatever time,
yes,
we'd see something that we've been missing the entire time. We're like, oh, that's why it's not working, or that's why it works, or whatever.
And the other thing that's interesting about that is you'll get something at a basic level. Like you're teaching a new person, you're just teaching them an upper block. So they'll get something at a basic level. And after years and years and years of doing it, something will click and they'll realize there's a couple other things hidden in that. And for a short window, that block is brand new again. And they're doing all sorts of different applications. And then after that level that they've just explored is plumbed through, it's just the block again. But then 5 years later, that same thing happens again, and they notice a couple different applications there. But we've gotten a field, and I'm rambling. So circling back to communication,
it's fine. I love jiu-jitsu.
Circling back to communication, the key is the more that you talk to people, the more likely it is that they're going to get your message and they're going to retain it. But something else happens too. And in my opinion, this is, again, a big part of the disconnect between employers and employees now. If I'm talking to you constantly about what's going on and how it impacts you, a certain level of relationship springs up organically. And in that relationship is where trust is born. And if there's trust, we're likely to be more receptive to each other's messages because we don't feel like they're coming from a bad place. So said differently, nothing bad comes from honest engagement. Nothing bad comes from communicating.
That's true. Yeah. I've worked on a lot of leadership teams, and I think there's this fear, and I'm not sure exactly where it comes from, that if they share too much, right? If they've given away too much information, that it's going to completely freak people out, or whatever the case may be. When it comes to layoffs in particular, and a lot of employers, what they're doing is they go completely silent. They disappear, for a couple of weeks because they don't know what to say. And, like we just mentioned, what do we do naturally? We're going to fill that gap in with the worst case scenario. Well, my leadership team isn't saying anything about it. We're definitely going to have a layoff, and then they come back and they're like, no, we're not going to lay anybody off. We're fine. But that damages the trust a little bit. So yeah, it would be great to have that transparency and that open communication from both sides. Like I would love if someone wanted to leave my team, for them to come to me and say, hey, I'm thinking of leaving, I'm not getting the growth that I want, or whatever the case may be. And I might be like, okay, I understand. And I'd love to support you. I'll give you a referral, whatever you need me to do. Like, I want that kind of relationship at all levels of an organization, and that's one of the reasons why, the bigger places, it's kind of hard to make that impact as an individual, because they're so massive. It's like I'm shooting a BB gun at the Titanic, trying to get the Titanic to change directions. Like, it's just not going to happen. But, startups, they're in the best position to establish a healthy culture, right? They're small enough where they can find these sorts of issues and nip them in the bud, like immediately, and then as they grow and as they add more people, solidify that healthy culture, and that open form of communication. That's really where I've been spending a lot of my time is with startups and trying to understand, like, how can we get in on the ground floor and set them up to have that good relationship with their employees.
I agree. And in my experience, where the disconnect happens is somewhere between the startup and scale up, when that team of leaders, even if they do start off right, brings in the next team of leaders and they assume that they're going to do things the same way, rather than ensure through supervision and guidance that they are doing things the same way. I think that's where you'll often see that scrappy startup that's just amazing to work with. They get to a certain point and now they're just plain Jane everyday company, and they lack that fire. It's like Apple became Microsoft or something. I never miss a chance to take a shot at Bill Gates. But yeah, so I think that happens because the leaders stop doing the things that got them where they are, but more importantly, they don't raise that team of leaders under them to do what they did. They just assume that they will.
Yeah, and that's actually something I'd love to touch on. The saying goes that people don't leave bad jobs, they leave bad managers, right?
Yep.
All right. So one of the things that I've noticed in organizations that spawn new leaders is that they're not training them and they're not giving them adequate support. So these leaders are doing what they did as individual contributors, thinking like that's the way to lead a team. And you end up with someone who's micromanaging or, rubbing people the wrong way. It's an entirely different skill set.
100%.
And, I got lucky, right? I got lucky when I started leading teams myself. And my boss, who was one of the partners at the company, sent me to a training with this organization called AFCIA. And they were running a leadership program here in Virginia. It was like 2 hours once a week for like 7 weeks. And I got to meet a lot of generals and people that were high up at some of these government contracting companies. And I learned so much from there about how to lead a team, how to be a servant leader, right? And some of these concepts that a lot of people don't, like, unless you know what books to read and what courses to take, like, you're just sort of left to your own devices. Like, it's sink or swim. And I don't think that that's how it should be for leaders. It's the most,
100%.
It has the most leverage in a company. So why wouldn't you support them? Like, invest heavily in your leadership.
And what's most interesting is what you just described happens across all career paths. People assume that because you're a great salesperson, you're going to be a great sales manager. People assume that because you're an incredible developer, you're going to be an incredible team lead. Those are different skill sets. And they're one of the soft skills that for some reason there's this crazy assumption that we just have innately in us. And when the title is bestowed upon us, it blossoms and shows. In my life experience, that has not been the case. So it's a skill like any other that needs to be developed. And you couldn't be more right in that area as well. It's typically not. I think I shared the story with you another time when we spoke about my first job as a sales manager, where I got called into my manager's office and she said, "Hey, Jerry, would you like to be a sales manager?" I'm like, "Sure." She said, "That's what I thought you'd say," and handed me a box of business cards that had sales manager on it, brought me out to the floor and gave me my team. And that was my training. That was it. It could have gone better.
Wow.
For guys.
So when you went through that experience, like, who were your mentors, your leaders? Like, how did you learn how to lead a team?
So interesting. So I learned a lot in the Marines. The Marine Corps is known for its leadership. But where I struggled early on in my civilian career was translating how to speak civilian and how to take those incredible values that I still learned in the Marines about leadership in a language that makes sense and in a way that makes sense to people who didn't have the lived experience of being a Marine. So that was the initial disconnect that I had. But from a leadership perspective, there were a couple people, individuals like Mike Coleman, early in my career, but I did a lot of reading. The book that taught me the most, hands down, I talk about this every time, I know, broken record, is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's easily the most important business book ever run. Every child in my life, when they graduate from high school, gets a copy. It's critically important. And the part of it as it relates to leadership that really clicked the hardest for me was seek first to understand before being understood. So if you take that step, so many problems get averted before they even start. If I know why you're doing a thing a certain way, probably 90% of the time we can resolve it before we're doing this, before butting heads.
Yeah, the book that was the most influential to me at the time was Marshall Goldsmith's What Got You Here Won't Get You There.
Yes,
I still have the book somewhere in my library. Yeah. One of the things that he says in that book is that when he speaks to like senior leadership, management and stuff at organizations, is they sort of lose touch with what's going on. And so I believe it's in that book where he says you should go to the people that you work with on your team and ask them for feedback. So sort of reverse that directionality, right? And then when they give you that piece of feedback, to then follow up with them. Hey, I'm working on this. Here's my progress so far. What do you think? And have them hold you accountable for making a change. And that fell in line. It fell in line with the whole idea of servant leadership for me, right? I'm not there. The team doesn't work for me. I work for my team, right? I'm there to serve them, to help them, to make sure they have everything they need, and then get out of the way, right? Let them do what they do best. And that served me phenomenally over the years.
Yeah, people don't care what you know until they know that you care about their outcome. They can care less until they realize that.
Yes,
I couldn't agree
100%.
more. Let me ask you this. If you could give advice to a startup leader, a founder, an early stage business leader, a small business operator, as it relates to leading their team, what advice would you give them?
I wasn't prepared for that question. Let me think. So the first thing that I would say is, don't go longer than a week or two without checking in with your team. Right? Make sure that they're doing okay. Make sure they've got what they need. And do it in private. Give them 15 minutes each. Meet with them. See what that's one thing. Like when the pandemic was happening, we had all sorts of horrible things happen, right? We had massive riots. We had, people being murdered, all this stuff. And I had a team of people that were really being impacted by what they were seeing on the media, to the point where they had to take time off because they couldn't, there was just so much happening. And I remember checking in with them, with various people, and them telling me that, like in private, and saying, yeah, I need time off. And I said, sure, by all means, please take time off. I need you to be able to focus. If I didn't have that conversation with them, I wouldn't have known. And, who knows what could have happened? They would have been sick. They could have called out for even more days, like, all sorts of things. So definitely that's my one piece of advice, is check in with your team. Don't leave them out there on their own. Let them know that they're being supported. And that'll come back to you. It'll pay dividends in the future.
Yeah, and don't assume. I love that.
Don't assume.
I'd like to wrap up here because I can sense that we could talk all day. So let's wrap up here. I'd love to have it on the show again. I think we have a ton more to talk about. But in the meantime, how can people reach out to you? Talk to us a little bit about the exact service you offer and how they can get in touch.
Yeah, so the best way to get in contact with me is through LinkedIn. My URL is /Jonathan, JONATHAN, Corrales, CORRALES. That's the easiest way to find me. What I'm offering at the moment is I'm helping people in tech prepare for job interviews. So I'm showing them how to turn a Q&A session into a conversation, how to
Awesome.
give interviewers that feeling of what it's like to work with you, to show what it's like to work with you. And I've been having great results. I took one guy from 0 interviews, no phone screens, nothing, to 2 finals and 1 job offer in 7 weeks in this
Nice.
job
That's
market.
awesome.
And I was like, I don't know if I could repeat that. So I took another person, another person who was recently laid off on H-1B, had started their 60-day grace period, to a job with one of the biggest financial companies in the US in 8 weeks. So it is possible to get a job rather quickly in this job market if you have really good interviewing skills and you can make a lasting impression. That's the most important thing, is you wanna be memorable in that interview. And that's
I
my
love that. I couldn't agree more.
that's my elevator pitch.
No, it's a good one. That makes perfect sense. And any listeners or viewers, that link will be in the show description, so you can see it there as well. Well, I'm going
Yeah,
to
I
wrap
appreciate
up
that.
here and say thank you all for listening. Look forward to talking to you again next week. If you haven't already, wherever it is that you consume this podcast, please give it a like and a subscribe. And don't keep us a secret. Both Jonathan and I are looking for wider exposure. So share us everywhere. But until we talk again, have a great week and go make something awesome.
Thank you.